United States History by Joseph Jarrell, Chapter 10, The Age of Jackson from 1820 to 1840. Although the period from 1820 to 1840 is often named for Andrew Jackson, it was actually well underway before Jackson's 1829 inauguration. Since the beginning of the century, powerful cross-currents were tossing the political and social seas. Jackson would ride into office on its turbulent crest, but the age was shaped by forces much larger than any man. Widespread currents of nationalism, sectionalism, and democratization originated before Jackson's presidency, and they would shape America's future long after Old Hickory was gone. Number one, cross-currents. Nationalism. The years immediately following the War of 1812 saw a growing spirit of nationalism, loyalty, and devotion to one's nation. The relief and the prospects that came with peace bolstered national pride and vision. The rapid expansion of the period gave the nation 7 more states by 1821: Louisiana, 1812, Indiana, 1816, Mississippi, 1817, Illinois, 1818, Alabama, 1819, Maine in 1820, and Missouri in 1821. In addition, a new generation of intelligent and energetic leaders, men such as John Quincy Adams, Daniel Webster of New England, Henry Clay of Kentucky, and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, were advancing the vision of the strong, prospering America. At the heart of the new nationalism was a concern for the economic strength of the nation. Henry Clay, the chief advocate of this economic nationalism in Congress, called it the American system. Clay's system consisted of 3 parts: protective tariffs, renewal of the national bank, and international improvements. Prospective tariff. Jefferson's Embargo Act, Chapter 9, and the trade disruptions brought by the War of 1812 had the unexpected benefit of stimulating the growth of American manufacturing. This was an important step toward economic independence from Europe. Since colonial days, America had served as both a source of raw materials for Europe, particularly Britain, and a market for British finished goods. American manufacturing brought some changes to this long-standing agreement. The British were quick to see the threat to their own interests posed by Americans' infant industry, and they determined to stop it. One member of the British Parliament even urged his country to sell goods to America well below cost to stifle or smother in the cradle those rising manufacturers in the United States, which the War of 1812 had forced into existence, contrary to the natural course of things. A tariff is a tax on imported goods, and a protective tariff is an unusually high tariff designed to shield a nation's manufacturers from foreign competition. The Tariff of 1816 was America's first such protectionist legislation. When trade resumed with Britain after the War of 1812, the British sold their goods far below the cost of American merchandise. They could do so because their factories were more advanced than those in their former colonies. Consequently, few Americans bought the more expensive American products. The tax imposed by the Tariff of 1816 increased the cost of foreign goods and thereby eliminated the British price advantage. The tariff, however, was a two-edged sword. Although it encouraged some American economic growth and increased the sale of American products, it meant higher prices for customers. Also, growth was hindered in regions of the country that produced raw goods, such as the agricultural South, or that depended upon shipping for their livelihood, such as New England. These 2 regions were hurt by weakened foreign trade. At first, economic independence outweighed other considerations, but protective tariffs later became a divisive issue between the regions. Second National Bank. The charter for the First National Bank expired in 1811. State-chartered banks and private banks issued their own paper money. Without a national bank to regulate currency, prices rose rapidly. The financial problems created by this inflation were enormous. Interestingly, the Republicans of the 1790s were vigorously opposed to both a national bank and a protective tariff. When in power, though, they tended to set aside their constitutional qualms in favor of such Federalist ideas. In 1860, nationalistic Republicans approved a 20-year charter on a second Bank of the United States, patterned after Hamilton's first central bank. Such a bank would assist economic growth by providing uniform currency, a source for loans to the public and private sectors, and a place to deposit government funds. International improvements. Another key element of the American system was internal improvements, funding for roads, canals, harbor developments that would bolster commerce and communications. Such improvements would help link Western goods with Eastern markets and provide better routes for settlement beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Despite the many advantages of internal improvements and their popularity with the growing West, they were the least successful aspect of the American system. President Madison and others believed that they lacked constitutional authority to fund such projects. Why should Maine, they reasoned, be taxed to pave a road in Maryland? Roads and canals were the responsibility of the state or local that they served. Younger Republicans complained that the president's narrow views were hindering economic growth. Calhoun, for example, protested to the president that the Constitution was not intended as a thesis for the logician philosopher to exercise his ingenuity on. It ought to be construed with plain good sense. Before the issue of internal improvements became such a controversy, one important step was approved: the building of National Road. Construction of the first part of this graveled road began in 1811 at Cumberland, Maryland. Lack of funding later halted construction. After considerable debate during the Madison years, Congress appropriated additional funds to extend the route to Wheeling, Virginia, now West Virginia. Further funding in 1825 drove the road into the heart of the new western states, reaching Zanesville, Ohio, and by 1839 ending in Vandalia, Illinois. Today, motorists on Interstate 70 east of St. Louis travel basically the same route that pioneering families took in the 1830s by covered wagon, ox cart, or on foot. Sectionalism. Monroe's era of good feelings amounted to little more than that, just feelings. When problems emerged in the country and tough questions were raised in Congress, the good feelings soared and drove the sections of the country further apart. Sectional strife would have a large impact on the politics of the coming Jacksonian era. Panic of 1819. After the War of 1812, the resumption of trade and the growth of domestic industry and Western land sales brought an economic boom to the country. Yet two unrelated events, an ocean apart, quickly sent America's post-war prosperity tumbling, resulting in a depression or panic called the Panic of 1819. In England, the price of cotton fell sharply, owing to higher American prices and the introduction of inexpensive cotton from India. The collapse of cotton prices led to a decline in demand for other American goods. The financial failure was due in part to the high protectionist tariff in 1816, and many people, particularly in the hard-hit South, were quick to point to this. The Virginia Agricultural Society told Congress in 1820 that the tariff unfairly favored a privileged class by granting them oppressive monopolies, which are ultimately to grind both us and our children after us into dust and ashes. The second factor contributing to the Panic of 1819 was the irresponsible action of state banks and the National Bank. The opening of Western land purchases seemed to present a golden opportunity for banks to make loans to settlers and land speculators, people who purchase land with the intent to sell later at a higher price. Banks made a large number of loans to both groups. When the economy worsened, many people could not pay their loans and lost their lands and homes. Fraud and scandal had occurred in the Bank of the United States, and many people, particularly in the South and West, blamed it for the economic difficulties. In those regions, bitterness toward the National Bank grew. Missouri Compromise. The routine admission of new states suddenly sparked a heated controversy, one that John Quincy Adams afterward described as a title page to a great tragic volume. In 1819, there were 11 slave states and 11 free states. When Missouri applied for statehood that year, its constitution permitted slavery, not surprising, considering that Missouri had 10,000 slaves at the time. The question of political balance between the South and the North lay at the heart of the debate. The South, some time before, had lost control in the House of Representatives to a more populous North. Balance in the Senate, therefore, remained critical to the region's political equality. In February of 1819, Representative James Tallmadge of New York proposed a resolution that prohibited slaveholders from bringing new slaves into Missouri. It also stated that enslaved children born there after Missouri received statehood would obtain freedom at the age of 25. The Tallmadge Amendment brought an outcry from the slave states because it interfered with the state's laws. Furthermore, because slavery would be gradually eliminated there, it threatened to balance the Senate. Voting along sectional lines, House members approved the Tallmadge Amendment despite Southern objections. However, the amendment was defeated in the Senate. Maine's application for statehood in the summer of 1819 and the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay's skillful handling of the controversy helped provide a compromise solution to the statehood stalemate. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 proposed that Maine be admitted as a free state and Missouri as a slave state, and that in the rest of the Louisiana Territory slavery not be permitted north of 36 degrees. Missouri's southern border, by a narrow margin, Congress approved the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri controversy exemplified the growing turmoil concerning equality and liberty. Political lines were drawn between the regions, and with the ever-expanding westward settlement, Missouri represented a problem that would not soon go away. Southern states wanted to maintain an equal number of senators with the North and wished to retain the right to own slaves. Meanwhile, a growing number of Americans objected to the fact that slaves were denied both liberty and equality. Democratization. Another growing force during the first quarter of the 19th century was increasing access to the political process. This democratization gave the average citizen a greater voice in the government. Thus, there was now greater equality in participation. Political expansion was evident in three major changes during this period. First was the emergence of universal manhood suffrage for white men, voting rights for all adult white males, not just property owners. New Western states entering the Union, unbound by the political customs of the older states, drafted more democratic constitutions that helped open the way for this change by the 1830s. Some free black men also received the right to vote. Second, the people gained a greater voice in presidential elections. In the early years of the Republic, most electors in the Electoral College were chosen by their state's legislature. By the 1820s, however, the majority of the presidential electors were selected by popular vote, giving voters a greater influence in the choosing of their president. Even though increasing numbers of common people were able to vote, the electorate usually chose their leaders from the upper class, not their own ranks. In turn, these democratic changes encouraged the third important development, the fracturing of a one-party system and the emergence of a strong two-party system. Since Jefferson's 1800 victory, the Republicans had dominated national politics. In fact, the Federalists soon ceased even to be a threat in presidential contests. Without genuine competition, this single-party dominance made it seem that national politics had returned to President Washington's ideal. It became popular to criticize any hint of political division. Even Andrew Jackson, who would one day be among the most partisan of presidents, urged Monroe in 1816 to exterminate the monster called party spirit. Nonpartisan unity, like the era of good feelings, which it was a part, proved to be a fragile thing. The Great Awakening was a democratic event that affected not just religion but politics as well. Likewise, the political democratization of Jacksonian era affected religion. Some people became more willing to value their own understanding when interpreting Scripture, more than the guidance of a minister or the writing of Christian theologian. Taken to the extreme, this approach made human reasoning the final authority rather than Scripture itself. Many new religious groups formed during this period, as men dismissed previous generations' careful study of Scripture and developed doctrines that they personally found more reasonable. Death of King Caucus. From 1796 to 1820, a congressional caucus selected the presidential and vice presidential nominees for its party. A caucus is a closed meeting of party leaders. Therefore, after Republicans became the dominant party, a handful of congressmen chose the President of the United States. 3 members of the Virginia dynasty, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, serving a total of 24 years, were selected by the closed-door caucus method. Despite those impressive presidential choices, the reign of King Caucus understandably came under fire as undemocratic. As early as 1800, one newspaper criticized this fictitious meeting to this self-appointed, self-elected, self-delegated club or caucus or conspiracy, charging that about 24 men were deciding for the people of the United States who should be president and vice president. The 1824 election proved to be a political turning point in America. The caucus system of nominating candidates was completely discredited, and the divisive presidential campaign that year ended the idea of a nonpartisan government. A corrupt bargain. 4 men threw their hats into the ring as candidates for president in 1824. William H. Crawford of Georgia was the choice of the dying Congressional Caucus, a fact that did him more harm than good. John Quincy Adams, son of the former president and Monroe's Secretary of State, announced his candidacy. In addition, 2 Westerners joined the slate of candidates, the popular Speaker of the House, Kentuckian Henry Clay, and the hero of New Orleans, General Andrew Jackson of Tennessee. The 4-way race was not among competing parties, since all the candidates were at least in the name Republicans. Heirs of Mr. Jefferson, rather the race was between competing personalities and the regions of the country. The results were predictable. No candidate received a majority of the votes. In the Electoral College tally, Jackson polled 99, Adams 84, Crawford 41, and Clay 37. The popular vote, which was recorded for the first time, gave, in rounded figures, Jackson 154,000, Adams 109,000, Crawford 41,000, and Clay 48,000. Since no candidate had won a majority, the 12th Amendment required that the election be decided by the House of Representatives. There, the president would be chosen from among the top 3 candidates from the Electoral College. Clay, who finished 4th, was placed in a unique position. He could not win the election, but as the powerful Speaker of the House, he could decide who would. Clay preferred the nationalist policies of Adams, and he considered Jackson unqualified. It was an easy decision for him. He supported Adams. Consequently, Adams won the first ballot. Jackson's supporters were outraged. Old Hickory had won the most electoral and the most popular votes in the general election. Why, then, was Adams president? Adams then compounded the problem by nominating Clay as Secretary of State, a position that had already produced 4 of the 6 presidents, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and John Quincy Adams. Jackson's supporters claimed that Adams and Clay had made a corrupt bargain, an underhanded deal to give Adams the presidency in returning for making Clay secretary. Although no proof of a prior deal exists, the charge hurt Adams personally and impaired his administration from the start. Adams had had a distinguished political career. Having served capably in several offices, his performance as Secretary of State under James Monroe, particularly his settling of differences with Britain and his negotiation of the purchase of Florida from Spain, have caused some historians to rate him as one of the greatest secretaries in state history. He was unquestionably brilliant and morally conscientious and consistent. Nevertheless, he was an ineffective president. Like his father, Adams had little patience for political maneuvering, and he often did not understand the people when he was asked to lead. In his first annual address to Congress, for example, Adams urged the members to support his proposal for internal improvements, saying that they should not fold up their arms and proclaim to the world that we are paralyzed by the will of our constituents. His seemingly low regard for voters strengthened the pro-Jackson forces. One of the key features of Adams' administration was its strong nationalist emphasis. Expanding on Clay's American system, Adams worked for higher protective tariffs to encourage American manufacturing and internal improvements. He then proposed federal funding for higher education and the arts. The nationalist thrust became a distinguishing mark of Adams' wing of the party, which became known as the National Republicans. The Jackson wing kept the old name Democratic Republicans, but eventually dropped the Republican part, keeping the name by which the party is still called the Democratic Party. Rematch and revenge. The candidates and perhaps the outcome of the 1828 election were probably determined 4 years earlier. It was an Adams-Jackson rematch, and by that time many of the former Crawford-Clay supporters had moved into Jackson's camp including a shrewd New York senator named Mark Van Buren. Van Buren's skillful political maneuvering ended the 5-foot 6-inch native Kinderhook, New York, the nickname Little Magician. He helped organize the Democratic effort and urged Jackson to avoid mentioning divisive issues, emphasizing instead a symbolic campaign, Old Hickory, the friend of the common man. Unfortunately, the election was bitterly fought. Both sides engaged in extensive mudslinging, criticizing each other tirelessly and engaging in personal attacks. But in the end, Jackson and his running mate, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, won by landslide, getting 56% of the popular vote and an electoral tally of 178 to 83. The election's two-party competition also boosted voter participation. For the first time, more than 1 million voters cast ballots for the presidency, triple the number in the 1824 election. John Adams had been swept from the White House in 1800, and now, nearly 30 years later, his son John Quincy Adams was suffering the same fate. In March of 1829, record numbers attended the inauguration. The celebrating crowd poured into the White House. They stripped wallpaper of souvenirs, scooped out globs of melting ice cream, and dripped trails on it on the carpet, smashed furniture and glass, gripped the hand of the mansion's newest occupant, Andrew Jackson, just before he slipped out the back door to leave the house to its fate. As one unamused observer grumbled, the reign of King Mob seemed triumphant. Although it is true that the invading army of Jackson's supporters could be faulted for being a bit disorderly, they should also be credited with providing a fitting start to a new American era, the age of Jacksonian democracy, the age of the common man. The Jackson Years, Old Hickory. The Democratic movement that won Jackson the presidency was underway before Old Hickory became its popular hero. By joining the movement, Jackson brought his fame to the national political stage. His remarkable life supplied more than enough material for his hero's image, and by 1828 Jackson's biography read like a brief history of the United States. Jackson was born in Carolina backcountry in 1767. His parents were Scotch-Irish, who had left Europe just 2 years before their son was born. Frontier life was challenging and dangerous. Andrew Sr. died in an accident while clearing his field for spring planting. 3 weeks later, his grieving widow gave birth to a third son, giving him the name of her dead husband. Young Andrew's life was rugged and difficult. At 13, he joined Patriot forces against the invading British, serving as a messenger. In April of 1781, Andrew and his brother Robert were captured by British cavalry. When one of the officers ordered Andrew to clean his boots, Jackson refused. The enraged officer slashed the boy on his head with a sword and hacked at his raised arm. Jackson would bear the scars of his defiance for the remainder of his life. After the war, Jackson studied law in North Carolina and was submitted to the bar. The young lawyer soon became a public prosecutor in the Tennessee Territory. The opening West well suited the fiery, energetic Jackson. He acquired land, slaves, horses, and a taste for politics. Jackson became a state judge and in 1796 was elected to the term in Congress, where he gained some respect with his straightforward, though sometimes harsh manner. Jackson's reputation, however, was not made in Washington. It was forged on the frontier, fighting Indians and redcoats. General Jackson drove his men hard, but he drove himself harder. His grit earned him the admiration of his ranks. "He's tough as hickory," they would say, and so he was. But Jackson displayed many flaws in the years before he won the presidency. During the War of 1812, he ignored a treaty that had been negotiated with the Creek Indians. He confiscated huge portions of their land, even from those Creeks who aided him in the conflict. As noted in Chapter 9, he led soldiers into Florida and then controlled by the Spanish in 1818. There he exceeded his orders and nearly caused a war with Spain. He was brutal in his treatment of the Seminole Indians in the region. In 1824, former President Jefferson said, "I feel much alarmed at the prospect of seeing General Jackson become president. He is one of the most unfit men I know for such a place. He has had very little respect for law or constitutions, though he is an able military chief." The People's President. Spoils of Victory. Jackson's partisan victory for the people ushered in the change in the filling of government jobs. The new president believed that public service should be a lifelong career. Until this time, bureaucratic officials such as clerks, postmasters, revenue collectors, and court officers were appointed to serve on a fairly permanent basis. Jackson held that men who stayed in public office for too long were prone to be corrupted by their power. Accordingly, after reasonable intervals, particularly with the change of administrations, rotations in office should occur. Jackson actually took a low-key approach to replacing office holders. During his first year in office, he turned out only 9% of the appointed office holders he inherited and less than 20% during his 2 terms. The significance of Jackson's replacement of government office holders was not so much that he did what he started. This spoils system, giving government jobs to political supporters, would endure for half a century. While it is true that Jackson's policy did shake up an entrenched bureaucracy, it also removed some highly qualified individuals from office at times and replaced them with highly unqualified individuals. Neither did the spoils system necessarily make public servants more responsive to the public, since the bureaucrats owed their job to their party leaders, not to the people. Kitchen Cabinet. Jackson's cabinet members were given their posts as political rewards for service rendered during the campaign, but they actually had little influence with the president. Jackson's real advisors were a close circle of friends that critics called his kitchen cabinet. It included newspaper editors, prominent Democrats in Congress, and his Secretary of State, Martin Van Buren. All political insiders, increasing the president, was taking on the role of party leader. Almost from the onset, Jackson's administration was torn by infighting, particularly the jockeying for power between Martin Van Buren and Vice President Calhoun. Van Buren increasingly sought the favor of President Jackson in an effort to limit Calhoun's influence. In addition, the sectional differences between the New Yorker and the South Carolinian heightened the dispute, particularly over the tariff question. Calhoun, who had been an ardent nationalist in the War of 1812, was becoming the major spokesman for the interests of the South. Nullification crisis. At the time of Jackson's inauguration, the tariff controversy was raging again. In 1828, Congress passed a new higher protective tariff with rates of up to 50% on some imports. The more industrialized North welcomed the tariff, while the South dubbed it the tariff of abominations. Southern leaders recognized the constitutional right of Congress to levy modest tariffs to raise revenue. However, they considered tariffs aimed at protecting a particular class of favoring one section of the country over another to be unconstitutional. The North favored a high protective tariff to curb competing foreign imports. The South, though, depended on foreign imports in exchange for its agricultural exports. Higher tariffs meant higher prices in the South. Higher sales of northern goods, revenue the government received from the tariffs, therefore, came largely from the South, but was mostly spent in internal improvements in the North. In short, Southerners viewed the high tariff as a discriminatory tax. In December of 1828, South Carolina legislature officially declared the new tariff unconstitutional. It further suggested, as had Jefferson and Madison in the Kentucky-Virginia resolutions, that any unconstitutional federal act could be nullified, declared invalid by the states. Georgia declared the tariff unconstitutional the same month. Mississippi and Virginia did the same 2 months later. The issue of nullification was drawn from an anti-tariff pamphlet published unanimously by Vice President Calhoun. The South Carolina proposed the doctrine of nullification, whereby states could nullify or reject constitutional acts they deemed unconstitutional. Congress could either change the law or send it to the states as a constitutional amendment to be ratified or rejected. Nullification was Calhoun's attempt to find a constitutional middle ground between submission and secession, withdrawing from the country. Nullification raised both tempers and constitutional questions in Congress. In a celebrated debate in January of 1830, Senator Robert Hayne, a gifted orator from South Carolina, rebuked New England's opposition to secession as inconsistent, since it had considered secession itself in the Hartford Convention of 1815. Hayne further denounced the tariff of 1828 and proclaimed nullification the only hope of self-preservation for the South and the West. Daniel Webster, a senator from Massachusetts and perhaps America's finest orator, defended New England in his response to Hayne. He insisted that the people of the United States as a whole, not as individual states, had ratified the Constitution. Webster declared it is the people's Constitution. The people's govern it, made for the people, made by the people, and answerable to the people. Therefore, he said, a state could neither secede or nullify an act. Webster's speech climaxed with the famous phrase, liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable. His views, however, like those of others involved in the controversy, appeared inconsistent. In 1815, he too had supported the Hartford Convention's decision to secede if Congress denied its demands. Opponents charged that Webster was seeking only what was best for his state and region. In 1815, secession had appeared best for New England. In 1830, enforcement of the tariff was best for New England. The nullification issue smoldered for a few years. A new conflict arose in 1832. In May of that year, John Quincy Adams, who had returned to Congress after his unsuccessful bid in 1828 for re-election to the presidency, proposed a revision to the tariff of 1828. Congress passed the revised tariff, which was lower than that of 1828, but still higher than most Southerners wanted. Jackson signed it in July. The South Carolina legislature responded by calling for a special state convention that in turn declared the tariffs of both 1828 and 1832 unconstitutional, and therefore null and void. The convention further declared that South Carolina would secede if there were any attempt to collect the tariff duties. Senator Hayne resigned his Senate seat when he was elected governor of South Carolina. John C. Calhoun resigned as vice president to take Hayne's place on the Senate floor. Calhoun's resignation climaxed months of worsening relations between the president and vice president, a conflict that had become increasingly public. At a banquet in 1830, Jackson had pointedly looked at Calhoun as he raised a toast. Our Union, it must be preserved. Without missing a beat, Calhoun rose and presented his own toast, the Union, next to our liberty, most dear. Despite Calhoun's maneuverings, only a little sympathy and no support could be found for South Carolina's action. As angry, Andrew Jackson threatened to hang Calhoun and secure from Congress consideration and later passage of the Force Bill, which gave the president the power to use the military against South Carolina. In his proclamation to the people of South Carolina, Jackson warned, "The laws of the United States must be executed. I have no discretionary power on the subject. My duty is emphatically pronounced in the Constitution. Those who told you that you might peaceably prevent their execution deceived you. Their object is disunion. But be not deceived by names. Disunion by armed force is treason. Are you really ready to incur this guilt?" Leaders in South Carolina declared that Jackson's constitutional views were erroneous and dangerous, and despite its friendless position, the state was prepared to repeal force by force and maintain its liberty at all hazards. Behind these bare-knuckle pronouncements, and an attempt on both sides to find a bloodless solution, at this juncture Henry Clay, the great compromiser, proposed a new tariff that substantially, though gradually, reduced the tariffs of 1832, making it acceptable to South Carolina. Clay's proposed tariff, known as the Compromise Tariff of 1833, passed on March 1st. In a parting shot to the president, though, South Carolina nullified the Force Bill. War had been averted, but there was little to cheer about. The crisis heightened tensions between the sections, and throughout the South there was a growing uneasy sense of loss of control over their destiny. As one South Carolina observer at the time of the nullification crisis, it's useless and impracticable to disguise the fact that the South is in a permanent minority and that there is a sectional majority against it, a majority of different views and interests and little common sympathy. Busting the bank. The major campaign issue, as Jackson faced re-election in 1832, was the future of the Bank of the United States. Jackson had little understanding of banking practices, but had a distaste for banks nonetheless. The Panic of 1819 was still a vivid, bitter memory in the West and South, and the bank was the culprit in the minds of many Americans. In the summer of 1832, the president of the National Bank, Nicholas Biddle, submitted the bank's charter to Congress for a 20-year renewal, though the existing charter did not expire until 1836. When Jackson learned that his old political rival, Henry Clay, had instigated the early renewal of the charter, hoping that it would help him to be elected, President Jackson said, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." The bank had such strong support in Congress that Clay believed he had a winning campaign issue. The recharter bill passed Congress. Jackson vetoed it, claiming that it was unconstitutional. The Senate was unable to gain a two-thirds majority to override Jackson's veto, thus the bank was to expire in 4 years. Clay thought the stage was now set for him to win the great victory. The election of 1832 introduced 3 new political ideas. For the first time in presidential election, a third party nominated a candidate. The anti-Masonic Party arose in opposition to Masons, a controversial secret society. It also opposed Catholic immigration and supported federal funding for internal improvements. The party established 2 other traditions. It used a platform, a written statement describing where the party stood on various issues. More importantly, it held a national convention where state delegates gathered to nominate the party's presidential and vice presidential candidates. The major parties quickly followed its example, and nominating conventions have since become a standard part of the American political process. Henry Clay was chosen as the presidential candidate of the National Republican Convention, while President Jackson was chosen as the Democratic Convention. The election itself was not so interesting. Clay had miscalculated badly. Support in Congress for the bank and support in the countryside turned out to be 2 different things. Jackson swept to victory with his old ally Van Buren as his new vice president, his re-election having convinced him more than ever that he was the choice of the people. Old Hickory turned his attention to the bank. His terms were unconditional surrender. Jackson claimed that withdrawing federal funds from the bank would lessen the negative effects on the charter's expiration in 1836. 2 secretaries of the Treasury refused to remove the federal deposits. Jackson fired both and then appointed Roger B. Taney as Treasurer Secretary in September of 1833. The next month, Taney began removing federal deposits and placing them in state banks, Jackson's pet banks, as his enemies called them. The bank's defeat was not a victory for the common man over the wealthy financiers, as Jackson had claimed that it would be. Jackson's actions were a two-edged sword. The loss of federal deposits in the Bank of the United States led the bank president to reduce the number of loans. As a result, fewer businesses could borrow money needed to expand. Some factories closed, and many workers lost their jobs. When businessmen urged Jackson to save the country from depression, he replied, "Go to Nicholas Biddle." Jackson blamed Biddle for the mounting problems, while Biddle said that Jackson was at fault. In 1836, when his charter expired, the Bank of the United States ceased to exist. Resettlement of the Indians. In his first inaugural address in March of 1829, President Jackson promised, "It will be my sincere and constant desire to observe toward the Indian tribes within our limits a just and liberal policy, and to give the humane and considerate attention to their rights and their wants, which is consistent with the habits of our government and the feelings of our people." The old Indian fighter, however, pursued Indian policies that were anything but just and liberal, and that showed a remarkable lack of humane and considerate attention to their rights and their wants. Indian removal. Even before Jackson took office, the United States had discussed moving all Indian tribes to the east of lands west of the Mississippi River and east of the Rockies. Such a policy seemed fair to the government, since it wanted the Indians' lands and did not want the western lands yet. The Indians were understandably less impressed with the fairness of the idea. When he took office, Jackson pursued the Indian removal policy vigorously. At his urging, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act of 1830 that authorized such actions. As a result, during his administration, no less than 94 treaties were made with the Indians, some of them forcibly. With the treaties as legal justification, the United States began moving the Indians westward and opening Indian lands in the east to white settlement. Indian resistance. Not all the Indians submitted meekly to this treatment. Some responded with violence, and in 1832 a group of Sauk and Fox Indians, under Chief Black Hawk, crossed the Mississippi River back into northern Illinois to reclaim their land. A force of regular soldiers and Illinois militia moved to intercept the Indians. The resulting Black Hawk War was brief but bloody. As with most U.S. Indian conflicts, the Indians suffered more and lost the war. More challenging was the Seminole War of 1835 to 1842. The Seminoles, led by the Canny Osceola, also resisted efforts to move them west. They hid in the swamplands and marshes of Florida as American troops tried in vain to track them down. Many battles and skirmishes occurred. Over 1,500 Americans and an unknown number of Indians died in this conflict. Most Seminoles were captured and sent west, but some hid in Florida until the government gave up and left them to live in peace. The Cherokees in the southeastern United States tried a different approach in their dealing with the American settlers. They adopted many features of white civilizations. They built communities with roads and schools and developed prosperous farms using European methods of agriculture. Many also converted to Christianity. A brilliant Cherokee named Sequoyah even developed a written Cherokee alphabet, allowing the Indians to publish newspapers and the Bible in their own language. Believing the earlier promises contained in their treaties with the United States, that they would be left to govern themselves, the Cherokees resisted removal. They soon found that Christian missionaries to their tribe were their strongest defenders. The leader of the missionary board that supported many of these missionaries petitioned Congress and wrote many newspaper articles in support of the Cherokees' rights. In response, the Georgia legislature passed a law targeting missionaries. It forbade white people to live among the Cherokees without government approval. Several missionaries were arrested for continuing their ministry among the Cherokees without such approval. 2 were sentenced to serve 4 years hard labor in state prison. These 2, Samuel Worcester and Elizur Butler, appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the missionaries. In Worcester v. Georgia, Chief Justice John Marshall ordered Georgia to release the missionaries and also told President Jackson to send troops into Georgia to remove white settlers who had moved into Cherokee lands. But Georgia and President Jackson ignored the court. Jackson reportedly said, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Many Cherokees still resisted, but by 1838 troops had forcibly moved those who had not already gone west in the Indian Territory, now Oklahoma. U.S. soldiers dragged the Cherokees from their homes, sometimes at gunpoint, and placed them in detention camps until the march west began. These forced marches west began in the summer, and sickness and drought killed many of the travelers. Several groups waited until fall, but heavy rains became a problem. Travel was difficult, and food was scarce. As winter set in, frigid weather, bad water caused more disease. About 4,000 of the 15,000 Cherokees died en route in the Indian Territory. The sick, the aged, and the very young suffered the most. The Indians called the relocation the Trail of Tears. Party politics. A strong indication of the Democratic forces at work during the Jackson years was the growing, organized, and even turbulent political competition of the era. Within a span of just a dozen years, from 1828 to 1840, 2 new national parties, Jackson's Democratic Party and his opposition, the Whig Party, competed effectively for the presidency and control of Congress. Jackson and anti-Jackson. Andrew Jackson's strong leadership at the presidential helm often made for many foes as followers. During his second term, though, Jackson was still popular. Opposition to him was growing. His fight against the Bank of the United States and federal funds for internal improvements angered many nationalists allied with Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams. In addition, his willingness to lower the tariff to ease the pressure on the South angered New England business interests represented by Daniel Webster. At the same time, Jackson's gruff treatment of South Carolina also aroused opposition throughout the South. These anti-Jackson forces, despite their differing regions and interests, formed a political alliance in the early 1830s that became known as the Whig Party. The Whigs derived their name from the British Party that traditionally opposed royal tyranny. Jackson's intimidating methods and the manner in which he dictated his policies to Congress and his cabinet seemed to his opponents to have the appearance of monarchy. The Whigs dubbed the so-called People's President King Andrew I and insisted that he did not have a monopoly on the common man's support. Besides being anti-Jackson, the Whigs were also a nationalist party. They sought to breathe new life into Clay's American system. Whig emphasis on optimism and opportunity had a national appeal across the young republic and attracted a new crop of young leaders such as Abraham Lincoln, Horace Greeley, and William Seward. The Whig Party quickly demonstrated that it had national organization as well as nationalist platform when it competed in the presidential election in 1836. Van's victory. Having won 98 seats in the House of the Representatives in 1834, the upstart Whigs devised an ambitious strategy for the 1836 election. Due to their fledgling status, their strategy was to run several candidates, each strong in his own region, who would carry enough states to prevent Van Buren from gaining a majority of the electoral votes. The election would then go to the House of Representatives, where the Whigs hoped to be strong enough to maneuver one of their men into office. Daniel Webster from Massachusetts ran in New England. William Henry Harrison, popular Indian fighter from Ohio, ran in the West, and Tennessee's Hugh White ran in the South. On the Democratic side, Martin Van Buren had been Jackson's hand-picked successor almost from the start. It was the case of Jackson and Van Buren. It seemed true that opposites attract. Though both were born in humble circumstances, they grew up in different worlds. Jackson became a planter and an Indian fighter, Van Buren a politician with polish. The 6'1" Jackson, with his shock of iron-gray hair, certainly contrasted with his balding, sandy-haired vice president, who was 7 inches shorter. Although the two men differed in background, appearance, and temperament, Old Hickory owed the little magician a great deal of his political skills in winning elections. With general, though short-lived, prosperity at the time of the election, Jackson's endorsement was really the deciding vote in Van Buren's favor. Even with Jackson's help, Van Buren won the popular vote by only 25,000 out of the 1.5 million votes cast. Van Buren became the last incumbent vice president to be elected president until 1989, when George Bush succeeded Ronald Reagan. Hard times. Just weeks after Van Buren took office, the economy collapsed, pulling the country into a deep 5-year depression known as the Panic of 1837. Banks and businesses failed, and unemployment grew across the nation. The economic hard times were caused by a number of factors. Jackson's economic policies, of course, had been a financial disaster. His malpractice worsened, though it did not cause all of the problems of the aligning economy. Wild, irresponsible practices among the state banks, as well as a massive wheat crop failure, and the collapse of cotton prices brought the economy to its knees. One historian argued that Jackson's short-sighted financial measures had sown the wind, and Van Buren was to reap the whirlwind. When it came to the economy, the little magician had no more tricks. Blame for the depression would hinder his administration his entire term. Van Buren had few solutions for the problems he had inherited, but he was determined to at least reorganize the government's financial structure. As a result, Van Buren proposed an independent treasury to replace the state banks as a depository for federal funds. The treasury was to have only federal funds deposited in it, and only government employees were to manage it. Sub-treasuries were planned for major cities throughout the nation. Van Buren's proposal was often called the sub-treasury system. This system would separate private banks from federal funds. The plan was proposed in 1837, but because of opposition, Congress did not pass it until 1840. Log Cabin Campaign. In 1840, campaign was one of the most colorful in our nation's history. A remarkable fact considering the rather dull candidates that the two parties offered the country. The excitement came from the images and enthusiasm that the parties, particularly the Whigs, were able to generate. The Democrats renominated President Van Buren and hoped to stretch General Jackson's popularity for yet another election. The Whigs realized that it would take more than a battered economy to turn the entrenched Democrats out of office. In 1840, Whigs reasoned, if you can't beat them, learn from them. As a result, they nominated an old Indian fighter, William Henry Harrison, the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe nearly 30 years earlier. They added John Tyler, a states' rights Virginian and friend of Clay, as running mate to broaden the ticket's appeal. In the campaign to follow, the Whigs would outgeneral the General's party. The Democrats thought bringing Harrison, who was nearly age 68, out of retirement was ludicrous. But the Whigs presented Harrison as a humble yet heroic backwoodsman symbolized by a log cabin. He was in contrast to the aristocratic Van Buren, who lived in the White House, or the Palace, as the Whigs referred to it. Actually, Harrison was born in a mansion belonging to his prominent political family. His father, a Virginia plantation owner, was the signer of the Declaration of Independence and later a governor of the state. Van Buren, who was the son of a New York tavern keeper, hardly had a luxurious upbringing, but facts were not allowed to interfere with either party's campaign. Torchlight parades, log cabin floats, and quantities of hard cider drew crowds for the Whigs. Throughout the country, the Whigs were just as imaginative with their campaign slogans, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, and Van is a used-up man. Songs often accompanied the noisy Whig parades. In this one, Tip refers to Harrison, and Matt makes reference to Martin Van Buren. Old Tip, he wears a homespun coat. He has no rifle, shirt, wort. But Matt has the golden plate, and he's a little squirt, wort. The Whigs rode their log cabin theme all the way to the White House, with an electoral landslide of 234 to 60. Harrison's inauguration was certainly anticlimactic compared to his campaign. One of the dreary cold days of March 4th, 1841, old Tippecanoe stood on the east steps of the Capitol and read his speech for nearly 2 hours. He delivered it, the longest in American history. While wearing neither an overcoat or hat, he then rode through the streets in the inaugural parade. That evening he attended 3 balls. The 68-year-old general was not well, as it was, and in the days after he moved into the White House, he found the flood of office-seekers trying to take advantage of his success overwhelming. Besides, his wife, Anna, was back home in Ohio. She had not been well enough to join him in the difficult journey by steamboat, stagecoach, and train to Washington. As a result, the White House was simply not in order. In the chill spring rain, he journeyed to the fish market and the butcher shop to stock the White House cupboards. A cold that had nagged him since his inaugural speech worsened, and in the speech he had pointedly declared himself to be a one-term president. Ironically, he was to be a one-month president. Stricken with pneumonia on April 1st, Harrison died 3 days later. A bare month after taking office, he was the first president to die while in office. The president's death stunned the nation. Harrison's larger-than-life campaign immediately suddenly turned mortal. The oldest president yet elected was now replaced by the youngest president yet to serve. The nation now faced its future under the leadership of Tyler, age 51, a man whom most had never expected would actually govern.